Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a webinar co-hosted by Leadership Ohio and the National Institute for Civil Discourse. My name is Jim Murray. I am the Vice President of the Board of Trustees for Leadership Ohio. Tonight's webinar is entitled Social Media, Misinformation, and Democracy. We have three wonderful panelists coming to you from different areas of the state and country. We have Dr. Timothy Shaffer, who's the chair of civil discourse at the Biden School of Public Policy, University of Delaware, and director of civic engagement and deliberative democracy. We have our Ohio Secretary of State, Mr. Frank LaRose, here this evening. And we also have Cleveland City Council member Stephanie Howse. So thank you to everyone who's helping us put on this event, and particularly our distinguished panelists. I want to encourage folks tonight, you can provide questions throughout the presentation through our Q&A function. So we encourage you to submit questions. We also hope that you'll utilize Twitter and Twitter at #CivilFuture, both throughout the event and to continue the discussion from there. To give you a short description of how we're going to work tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Shaffer to start. Then we're going to have Secretary LaRose give some commentary, and then Councilwoman Howse. And then we're going to open up Q&A, questions and answers, after those presentation and talk and speaking opportunities. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Shaffer. Again, thank you very much, everyone, for putting this on tonight. And we're very excited about the conversation.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And I will just say this out loud. I am now a Delawarean. Just voted in my first primary not too long ago. But I'm originally from Ohio, so Portsmouth is home, and I've lived in Dayton and a few times, multiple, in fact. And Put-in Bay used to be one of my favorite spots as a Boy Scout. So just want to put that out there, since I feel like we've got some very Ohio-centric conversations going on here tonight. Truly the heart of it all. But the reason I'm here, and I've got some slides, and then we'll have more conversation a little bit later, I'm going to help set up some of the discussion that's going to come in a bit around social media, this question about misinformation, and then fundamentally what it means for democracy. And so I want to begin with this question, right? How do you define civil discourse? One of the sponsors tonight is the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And so we think about this question quite a bit. And I want to point to two really good books that have come out in the last few years speaking to some of these scenarios of how we think about civil discourse. One, we published a book called A Crisis of Civility, and it highlights these distinctions, right? So we can talk about civility in two ways, as civility as politeness, right? So it's about following rules and kind of code of conduct, all of these scenarios in person or even online. But we also have this idea of civility as responsiveness, right? It's this sense, as that final bullet point under there highlights, we can agree to disagree, but maybe more than that, we should also think about disagreement as it's not being a reason to stop talking with one another. So these two categories, politeness and responsiveness. Another wonderful text, in fact, I'm using this in one of the courses I'm teaching now, has another set of kind of concepts. Weak civility, similar to that politeness. Strong civility, also that kind of responsiveness, but they also talk about pseudo-civility, right? When we use these rules and norms kind of to police others, either individuals or entire groups. And so what's most important for us is to really highlight this sense of the pseudo-civility, right? And what it means to affect how we talk to each other. And I'm going to show a graphic actually from this book. I'm not going to speak about it just because it's, well, it'll become clear here in a moment why this is not the category that I want to kind of say out loud, but it's helpful to put this up in a dramatic way as a way to visualize pseudo-civility. How do you call out those who might utilize structures or systems to hold us back from addressing issues of inequality or exclusion? If civil discourse is about engaging differences constructively, we need to be able to be honest about what we think and how we act. So which that, really fundamentally leads us to this question about mediated information and kind of communication in this digital age that we exist in. So what are the major factors that shape our sense of polarization and or partisanship in our relationship with social media and some of these corresponding concepts, things like bubbles or filters or these echo chambers, some terms you've probably heard before. We see this language in scholarship, people researching these areas, right, as well as popular media, right? Again, these filter bubbles, these echo chambers, even something called epistemic bubbles. There are some real and significant challenges here. And I want to call attention to one of these articles, and you can see it in the highlighted text here. Making this distinction between these epistemic bubbles, and that's just a fancy word for how we know things, and echo chambers. And this epistemic bubble, or these other voices, those that are different, they're not heard. In echo chambers, so a concept and a term we've probably heard some, other voices are actively undermined. And it's really important for us to be thinking about the spaces where we are and what happens, whether it's intentional or not. So pairing echo chambers and filters with something we call affective polarization is a significant issue. Affective polarization is a fancy way to kind of talk about this tendency of seeing people identifying as, say, Republicans or Democrats, and then identifying those who are those opposing partisans as these kind of enemies, not simply with a different set of policy views, but really as these enemies, these others. And those who share our views are kind of on the same team. What does this mean? Well, what we know from research is that party, and Pew has done some tremendous work in this area, that this is the primary way in which people identify themselves as it relates to values, more than things like race or religion, education, or even gender. Across 30 values, party is number one. So what happens? As Liliana Mason at Johns Hopkins University notes, we are ideologues without issues. What she means is there's an identity-based kind of ideology that drives us. And as her research points out, we have many people who fall into these ideological camps without really actually knowing substantively about the policy issues that underlie these party distinctions. So being a member of a political party means maybe wearing a hat, right, or having a flag, and maybe not a whole lot more substance beyond that. So this brings me to another question to reflect on tonight. What do you do when you come across information you disagree with or agree with? We're dealing with two related challenges, misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is basically information that's false, but not intended to cause harm. So for example, individuals who don't know a piece of information is false may spread it on social media in an attempt to be helpful. Disinformation is false information that is deliberately created or disseminated with the express purpose to cause harm. So producers of disinformation typically have political or financial, maybe even social motivations. We've seen kind of waves of this in our past, and we think about some of these in classic images from different periods of our history, such as World War II, maybe the Cold War. But for us, modern use of social media technologies have become platforms that go beyond sharing kind of cute photos of your cat with your grandmother to being scenarios where these are now enablers of disinformation with these real effects. The ways in which, say, conspiracy theories have leveraged social media, one of the primary ways in which we interact and engage with both people and ideas, is a real alarm when we think about the unfortunate effects of these echo chambers and these filter bubbles mentioned just a few minutes ago. Democracy requires us to be educated and informed citizen. This embrace of conspiratorial thinking by everyday Americans, as well as those individuals in elected office giving legitimacy to some of these views, is a grave concern. Why? Well, as Max Fisher, the author of the book that you're seeing here, puts it just recently, he said, and I'll quote him, "The amount of social media content doubles every year or so." So imagine, for instance, that a network produces 200 posts a day, of which you have time to read about 100. Because of the platform's tilt, you will see the most outraged half of your feed. Next year, when 200 doubles to 400, you'll see the most outraged quarter. The year after that, the most outraged eighth. Over time, your impression of your own community becomes radically more moralizing, aggrandizing, and outraged. And so do you. At the same time, less innately engaging forms of content, truth, appeal to the greater good, appeals to tolerance, become more and more outmatched, kind of like stars over Times Square, end quote. So in a basic way, it becomes really important for us to be smart when we're online. We must consider the sources of information, go beyond headlines, and question things that either feel troubling or immediately validating. We can't only look skeptically at those things we don't like. We must be critical and thoughtful of information that we might pass along to others, intentionally or not, becoming amplifiers of, say, misinformation, mistruths, or just blatant lies. And what we've learned a few years ago from the Rand Corporation report called Truth Decay is the loss of truth and factual information in American life. We see some of these drivers at the beginning of this and these trends with some real consequences. As we can see here, these drivers, these factors that have led to the moment we find ourselves in are largely shaped by the way in which we think about information and what we do with it. The report explores these historical eras, the 1890s, the 1920s, the 1960s, and in the last 2 decades. We see multiple trends, and some have been repeating over and over, not surprising. The most troubling thing for us is that we are in a moment where there is deep disagreement, this is that 4th point, about facts and analytical interpretations differently than we have in the past. We are increasingly not sharing a baseline, what is real or not. So some brief takeaways from NICD's Engaging Differences program, and you can see the link at the top there, engagingdifferences.org, are some ways to reinforce the need to check for accuracy, avoiding personal attacks, and seeking information from multiple perspectives. And at the end of the day, being willing to walk away if the interaction is not constructive. There are significant, large-scale challenges that we face. But there are also ways for us to do our part as citizens who engage in an environment where social media plays a role in our personal and civic lives. So I want to end here, and then we'll have comments from our other panelists. But if you're looking for more information about the National Institute for Civil Discourse or Leadership Ohio, you can find the links here. And appropriately, they're both on social media. So thanks so much. And I will stop sharing the screen here, and we'll continue our conversation.
Thank you very much. We appreciate all that presentation done so concisely. And that was a lot of wonderful information that folks can follow up on. I did want to let everyone know who is attending the webinar, we are recording it. So anyone who couldn't, for example, make it this evening would be able to watch a recorded version of it. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Secretary LaRose.
Well, hey, thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you for participating in this conversation. I want to thank NICD as well as Leadership Ohio for leading this conversation on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, something that I worked on during my 8 years in the state legislature and continue to work on now in my role as Ohio's chief elections officer, that it really matters. Tim talks for a better working environment. It makes for a more pleasant experience, but really civility is necessary to make self-government function. To make a democracy work the way that it's supposed to work, people need to be able to interact with one another. People need to be able to exchange ideas, and that requires a level of civility. If people are in a place where they are not willing to engage with one another in a constructive space, really a representative form of government can't function. And that's something that is crucial. So there are a variety of things that we can work on to make things better. I want to get to that in a minute, but I also want to have the historical context of understanding that I think sometimes it's tempting to think it's worse now than it's ever been. Sky is falling, hell in a handbasket, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's also not an accurate historical context. Remember that there have been contentious times in the public life of our nation from the very beginning. In fact, throughout human history, things have gotten contentious. There was a vice president and a secretary of the Treasury that shot one another in a pistol duel. There's a great play about it. You should check that out. There have been a member of the Senate that was beaten nearly to death with a cane on the House floor. At points, our nation went to war with itself in a civil war. So there are certainly challenges in our past face right now. Also, also, in the context of elections and elections administration, I think about this a lot in the work that I do as Ohio's chief elections officer. In the space of disinformation and misinformation, it's important that it's really vital that voters have accurate information about how to engage in the democratic process. In that sense, I've really focused on trying to combat false information with copious amounts of truth. I think that the best antidote to lies is truth and lots of it. And that's why we work to make sure that Ohioans know how easy it is to vote, how rare voter fraud is, for example, and things like that. I think it's also important that we talk about ways that we can make things better. The tribalism that exists today in American politics is causing us to not be able to do our best work in government. It's that sense that some people have where they wake up every morning and view the world as though they're a member of the elephant tribe, and so they must go to war with the donkey tribe, and they don't really think about why. It's just team red versus team blue, or vice versa. That's not really productive. And the other thing that it has caused is this sense that somehow compromise is a failure. That's a great fallacy. Compromise is, in fact, how statesmen and women solve problems in a democracy, and so we need to be able to encourage that and get back to it. The other thing is pushing back against the outrage industry. There's an entire industry that has evolved, and their job is to keep you outraged. It's on the left and it's on the right. It's often in media, but it's also campaigns, talk radio, what have you. And they know that if they can keep people enraged, that they will tune in through the next commercial break, or they will tune in to the podcast tomorrow, or they will attend the political rally or donate to the candidate. And so the outrage industry is really corrosive. And we as consumers of information need to learn how to sort of better understand that and not fall victim to the sort of constant 24-hour news cycle that the outrage industry constantly throws at us. I offer a pretty simple solution to a lot of these problems, and it comes down to getting to know each other on a human level. I look forward to hearing from my friend Councilwoman Howse. We served together in the state legislature, and some of the things that we really attempted to do during my time in the state legislature is just to create opportunities for Republicans and Democrats to interact with each other on a social basis. This may sound trivial, but we would organize, when I was in the state Senate, we organized bowling night. And this was one of these things where there were no journalists, there were no lobbyists. It was just pitchers of beer and people that serve in the state legislature getting to know each other in that kind of zany environment of a bowling alley. The other thing that I did, and this one always cracked me up, when I became a committee chairman in the Senate, I recognized that the way that traditionally the committee room was laid out is that all the Republicans sat on one side, all the Democrats sat on the other side, and then I sat in the middle as the committee chairman, as though we have to keep the kids apart or they're gonna fight. I started laying out our committee dais, the seating assignments, by alphabetical, or sometimes I would just mix it up and make people sit next to each other. The first time that members walked into one of my committees and realized that Republicans and Democrats had to sit together, it was almost a culture shock for them. But little things like that really, truly can make a difference. And so look forward to the rest of the conversation and some other ideas about how we can continue to improve the civic health of our nation and our state through civility.
Thank you, Secretary LaRose. I just want to remind our attendees for the webinar, you're again free to submit questions, either to a specific panelist or in general, but we ask you to do that through the Q&A function. I'll now turn it over to Cleveland City Council Member Howse for her comments.
Hi, well, good evening, everyone. Hey, Frank. Hi, Tim. And thank you to the Leadership Ohio team and NICD. Wow. So first, I want to say, like, just being on this Zoom, understanding that we being in this global pandemic, I know it is rough. So I just want to give a shout out to all the people who decided on a Tuesday evening, you're going to spend a little time with us. So I want to thank you all for coming to be with us. I guess just thinking about kind of this conversation of social media, misinformation, and democracy, I'm going to take it in each of those little buckets before we get into the Q&A. So social media is something I would say as a person on a personal level, you know, I'm a personal, like, private person, and it's just amazing how, you know, this this technology has allowed people to form kind of different ways to communicate and interact with people. And in some ways, it's like replacing the human relationship and connection. And I think the jury is still out if that is a good or a bad thing. I think in some ways, well, it's good because it has provided opportunities for us to broaden our reach to places and people that we've never been able to do before. Within that, though, I think we could take a step back, because while we have this broad reach, it's how do you know if the person that you're trying to connect with is real, right? I mean, people can come up with, you can be who you want to on the internet, right? And depending on what group or the place that you go, it really doesn't mean that is true. So I think, as we are in a place, looking at just life in general, like, you really have to connect yourself or just try to verify some of the best ways to be able to engage in these spaces. And if you are finding people that you have an attraction to, and I'm saying attraction in the global sense, whether it's ideas and things of that nature, being able to really verify. And that's the thing, is like, how do you verify what you're saying is going? And I know we'll probably get into ways that people can verify things. But I know it's just really, 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 really important to be able to verify just the stuff that you're getting. I know Dr. Shaffer talked about just literally giving the example of just the information overload. That is so real. And I know somebody has done some studies on what that actually is doing to our minds, our bodies, our emotions, of just getting this information overload. And so taking the time to, like I said, even unplugging so that we can kind of reset, engage and connect with some people, I think is just really helpful. When we talk about misinformation as you're using the tool of social media, I think that's one of those things too, where for me, I find value in having people around that hold you accountable, right? From, I've always been told been told that words are powerful. Words bring life, or words can create death, and for those of us that are in a place, in a position of influence, we have to be good stewards of what we are sharing, right? And having a very showing the human side of things, of we're going to mess up, right? That's human, but owning up to that and moving on and being able to identify so that people can take our word as bond, like to know that when you say stuff, it really means that. If I share stuff, they know at least I did my best to provide people accurate information. That I think is something for those of us who have influence, whether it's one person or 100 million people or more, having a level of responsibility. That's just something I think that for those of us that are in these leadership positions, especially politically, again, Dr. Shaffer, I'm telling you, that thing that you sent, the chart that talked about how people move and how just the politics, that in and of itself, I think shows the power of being in a tribe, right? The fact that the politics is more than race and age and income, that's to me, that is definitely very alarming, like very, very alarming. And I guess it'll lead me into my last point at democracy and what Frank talked about, just the human side of this. When I think about democracy and our democracy, I believe this is still a living experiment. You know, I know we have, as a country, we have some documents, and I know we're not going to even get into founding documents and country and place that was established, but we have a framework of sorts. And I think there's such opportunities for us to continue to get it right, understanding that we are continuously to grow and evolve and learn more. And in order to do that, we have to do it together. Right? There is no substitution for human interaction, human connection. There's just no substitution for it. And so for those of us, and I think there is and I still believe in the power of people. The majority of people are good in nature. I think the majority of people want what is right for the majority of us. And for those of us who ascribe to that, we have to use our voice, be courageous, and be brave when we see things are not getting off track and people are tearing people down, to speak up, right? And really trying to find some commonality so that we can get things done. You know, coming from a place in Cleveland, you know, for me, I'm like, all bets are off. Like, listen, we have to do, you cannot see the level of suffering of people and not realize what we currently are doing is not working. And so and the only way we are going to get there is get there together. And so in order for democracy to truly live, we gotta have the people centered and people coming together to make it a reality. And the information that we are sharing, not sharing, or falsifying really plays a part in us being able to do the fundamental work, which is ensuring that people have a better life. So that's kind of what I had to say. I know I was all over the place, but I tried to wrap a little bit into a little bit. So I'll pass it back to you, Dr. Shaffer.
Yeah, that's great. And no, and thanks for those comments. And I think I've got just a couple minutes with us, and then I believe Jim will do the Q&A. And I know some of those comments are coming in here. Just to touch on a couple points that both of you mentioned, and sitting as the professor in the group here, maybe I can just highlight a couple of these things. Some colleagues, a couple of really good books if people are interested. Secretary LaRose, you were talking about this kind of outrage industry. And so Sarah Soberai wrote a book with Jeffrey Berry called The Outrage Industry. It's a few years old now, but it really is quite good at thinking about political opinion, kind of media in this landscape. And then more recently, Donegal Young, in fact, a colleague here at the University of Delaware, published a book a couple years ago called Irony and Outrage. And it's all around this kind of polarized landscape of kind of rage and fear and laughter. So she really looks at late night comedy, but also talk radio, right? As these venues, when we think about some of this, right? So this platform, this space where it just kind of constantly fuels and gives oxygen a little bit to some of these challenges. Maybe one thing just to pose, since you're both sitting, I think as Councilwoman Howse kind of noted, right? You're in positions of power and authority, but more than that, of influence, right? Especially when we think about social media. So here's a very kind of targeted sort of question, but it's also applicable across the board. Rhetoric, language matters, right? So our sense of how we speak is really significant. We are on the cusp of another general election, right? We've just completed the primary season here. How do we articulate understandings around these processes to feel like we trust them or not, since especially the last few years, there's been such a contentiousness, largely unfounded, right, around some of these sorts of themes of voter fraud and the like of legitimacy, right? The themes of trusting in democracy and the processes, the institutions, the democratic institutions that make this work regardless of how it plays out, but trusting that the game is fair. Can you respond to this question of how this rhetoric around, maybe particularly we'll use the voter fraud sort of language as a tangible example of like the implications or what can be done or is being done to address that concern, since that is such a thing that's so prevalent, whether it's founded or not?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start off on this, and maybe I'll start off with the context of just warning people. I am hopelessly optimistic. I'm just an optimist about how I approach everything. And so maybe two pieces of good news about this whole conversation surrounding the politicizing of elections administration and that kind of thing, which is dangerous. First is that we are passionate about our voting rights and both the the integrity of our elections, but also access to our elections. We as Americans care deeply about that. That's good news, right? I've been to plenty of places around the world in my time, both in the military and doing foreign election observation missions, where people don't place a lot of emotion or care.
I think he's deep in thought.
Or care in their
There we go.
Our elections is in and of itself, it is in and of itself good news. But it's also something where politicians have learned that this is something that can be utilized, right? Because if you can get, and so there is unfortunately a tendency on both the left and the right to hype issues surrounding elections. Here's some very straight talk about this. On the right, you tend to hear this insistence that there is widespread systemic voter fraud. And so, hey, if you show up at my rally or vote for me or donate to my campaign, I'll make all that voter fraud go away. Well, in fact, voter fraud is exceedingly rare. We should keep it rare, but it is exceedingly rare. At the same time, at the flip side, on the left, you hear hyperbole surrounding voter suppression. And you'll hear people say that there is systemic widespread voter suppression, and that if you show up at my rally, donate to my campaign, vote for me, that I'll make all of that stop. Reasonable people should be able to say on both the left and the right that voter fraud and voter suppression are intolerable, ugly, illegal, and we're going to work hard to keep them both rare. But when politicians constantly tell people that there's widespread fraud on this side or widespread suppression on that side, all it really does is degrades the trust that people have in our elections. So what do we do about it? Again, my approach has been to flood the zone with a massive amount of accurate information. I'll give you a couple key examples. I've told our boards of elections to go set up a booth at the county fair. And again, especially in some of our rural communities, that is the social event of the summer. When people come up to the Board of Elections booth, it'll be as, hey, is this the voting machine, that person? You can engage with them and maybe help educate them on the issue. Likewise, I've told boards of elections to send Republican and one Democrat to go out and engage with people at a Rotary Club or another community gathering where people are interested in this topic. Recently, I instructed our boards of elections to have information ready for election day, because for some voters, especially those voters that only vote in those even numbered years, and we all know they exist, this will be the first time that a voter's walked into a voting booth for 2 years. And so when those voters come with a head full of false information, instead of laughing at them or dismissing them or whatever else, we're instructing our poll workers in Ohio, 50,000 poll workers at 4,000 polling locations, to take that moment in time to try to help educate that person. Give them the one page of information that we have on our website at voteohio.gov/secure, voteohio.gov/secure, that talks about all the things that we do to make our elections honest and trustworthy and accessible in Ohio, but also encourage them to be a poll worker. If you sign up to be an election official, you will get a great education in how honest our elections are, and why I can say without hesitation that it is both easy to vote and also hard to cheat here in the Buckeye State. Those are some of the things that we're doing about it, and I hope to hear more ideas from you all as well.
You can ask the next question. I know, how we're getting short on time, so.
Well, no, this is great. And in fact, I might give up my coveted spot of leading some of the conversation and turn it over to Jim here, but because I'm seeing the Q&A here.
Yes.
So lots of really great questions that I would be inclined to jump into some conversation here as well. But, I think maybe it's best for us all just to kind of step into that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to all three of you. I did see a comment that folks might be interested in receiving Dr. Shaffer's PowerPoint presentation. And I believe that's something that it's okay to share, Dr. Shaffer, with the attendee list.
Yeah, I can do that. I can have a cleaned up version. I never kind of hide that stuff. And I realized I was trying to be fast. I had 10 minutes and I had a lot of things to show and some good graphics and things like that. So So really happy to do that. So no problem with that.
Great, terrific. So with that, we're going to jump to some of our questions that were provided for folks attending the webinar today. The first is around this idea of the outrage industry. And can you say more about how that affects everyday Americans, and specifically what kind of solutions can happen from either the citizens themselves or perhaps the leaders or aspiring leaders in civil discourse?
So if I can jump in here just quickly, and then the others can kind of respond in the ways that they will. The short answer is turn it off. And I think that's the easy way to kind of respond to this. But the way, and that quote that I was mentioning about the kind of the sense of how these algorithms are shaped, it is by design. It's about engagement, but not necessarily with kind of good things, substantive things that are life-giving, right? It is about eyeballs on screens and things like that, right? So one of the factors here is that, particularly when we're thinking about social media, the other is to recognize what the function is of some of these platforms. And I'll use, I referenced a book, The Irony and Outrage text by Young a couple of years ago. This is why we see overwhelmingly the kind of political left and the nighttime talk shows, a little bit of variation, and on the kind of daytime talk radio, more right-leaning rather than left, because they serve different kind of purposes and audiences. And so recognizing these avenues of even where we kind of consume, whether we want to see it as being just in kind of enjoyment, but also realizing that this does shape how we think and how we function. And in a beautiful way, I've just moved across the country to a new place. And fundamentally, it's about meeting neighbors, right? So I think Secretary LaRose was talking about bowling, and one of the classic texts in the kind of civic space is Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, right? The sense that people were still bowling. We had this high point in the 1950s and kind of went down, but it was people were not bowling as kind of social clubs with neighbors or coworkers or colleagues, but it really was by themselves. It was with their immediate families and not kind of isolated. So they were losing that sense of connection, that social fabric. So I think one way to step back from the intensity of some of this outrage is to kind of take yourself out of those systems. If it's about taking an app off your phone, the mindless kind of doom scrolling, as we often hear it referred to, it's really easy, right? And then all of a sudden you've lost time of your life. And maybe it's just because I've hit a certain age, but now all of a sudden I'm thinking more about mortality and such. I'm like, what am I spending my time doing? Is it life-giving? Is it with people I care about in the immediate sorts of ways, but in the broader ways? And part of it is to step back from some of these systems, because the return of it is, I think, a real question. At the same time, this is infused in so many aspects of our life. You can't sign up for anything without using Facebook login, or this is how parent groups are connected, or how your civic organization functions, or how it fundraises, or how you get information about how to vote, and please vote, right? All of these sorts of things. And so we're torn, but in a beautifully human way. You're right, exactly, right? Vote as a core foundation of civic practice, but build upon that. And partly what allows you to build upon that is to see other people as people. There's a rich variation, and I'll give a shout out to Beth Shaffer in Portsmouth, Ohio. And I saw my brother's on here who works at the university down in Shawnee there. She has a line, and I say it all the time, it takes all kinds. And I think that's true.
All right.
I don't want to take all the time there. I didn't want to take all that
That's
space.
okay.
There are other responses there. I don't want to be that panelist. I apologize.
Okay. We'll jump to another question because we do have a nice set of questions from our audience here. The next question is: building relationships with people requires some level of trust and openness. In a world of anti-intellectualism, hyper-individuality, tribalism, inequality, and things that are barriers to trust and openness, what specific tactics do you recommend for a regular person around relationship building?
I'm gonna say in the words of Nike, just do it. Right. See, a lot of times when it comes to, and I will say, when I'm saying just do it, it's, you can be overwhelmed and put up a barrier because of all of the bad stuff. What if they don't like me? What if they want to talk to me? What if they don't build a relationship with me and never have any type of connection with people that may at least just want to work with you and build with you, right? I would say is just thinking through the things that people normally do. Many times you learn a lot by just observing people. You kind of understand, are they a coffee drinker? Are they a tea drinker? What do they like to eat? Where do they like to go? You know, what are the things? Do they like kids? You know what I'm saying? Just those things are cues of ways that maybe you can offer an invitation. It's like, hey, let's go grab a cup of tea together. Let's get some ice cream. Let's drink, get a beer, whatever, where you can find some level of commonality to develop a relationship. I will say though, I making the transition locally, I am seeing more and more how, because of life, many people are just busy doing life, that sometimes we have sacrificed relationships, right? And so I guess I would say, offering another suggestion of how do you, really, I get a tactic to build a relationship with people on a different political party, or those who might have a difference of opinions on you, is just like everything else that have created these busy schedules. I would say plan some intentional time in relationship building. Like if you don't plan to do it, then you won't get it done, and then won't get it done. And hence, and myself, like I spent 7 years in the state house, and there are so many people that I missed opportunities to build relationships with. And it wasn't literally until my last, the 7th year, I'm like, dang, I could have talked to you a long time ago. You know what I'm saying? So I think we really have to just be real intentional with our time, doing some swap outs from social media to relationship building, and we can go, in a pathway that we might want to go. So that's my thoughts.
I think I'm going to add to what my friend Councilwoman Howse had to say, and it is to be intentional about it. I guess for me, this maybe comes naturally because I grew up in a household where my dad is a Republican and my mom is a Democrat, and I love them both. And then at 18 years old, I ended up in the Army, where I was surrounded by people with a lot of different viewpoints, but we all had this common sense of mission together. And so for me, engaging with people from diverse viewpoints is something that just comes natural. But I think for many of us, we exist in this space where we are surrounded by people that think the way we think. We consume media that props up our preconceived beliefs, and those are never challenged. And so I think we need to be intentional. If you identify as a conservative, then you need to be intentional about engaging with people who have a more progressive or liberal worldview. If vice versa, if you're a liberal, you need to engage with people that have a more conservative worldview and actually engage in those conversations and get to know each other, because what you will probably find invariably is that you have a lot more in common than you have that differentiates you. Yeah, we may have different ways to get from point A to point B. We may have different solutions to the problems, but we all want the same thing. And that is a community that is more prosperous, more fulfilling, safer, all of those things. And again, that only comes from engaging with people with different points of view.
Thank you. The next question says, what's the best way to have a civil conversation when emotion and anxiety raise to a level that's difficult to cut through so that constructive dialogue can occur? And what specific techniques do you use to be successful?
We're all looking at each other.
Yeah, I would say that. No, I would say for me, at times I know I have to stop talking, especially when my emotions are getting high. It's stop talking, because I know how my mouth is. And so it's stop talking for a moment. And depending on, and I do make a determination if the space or individuals or people I actually want to, continue to get to a happy medium, or if there are ways and opportunities that we can build together. If the answer is yes, then you definitely have to wait till you are in a place where you can, think clearly and articulate what you want to get stated, so that you can start building and kind of work through some of the things. I also think it could be another strategy is getting a real trusted mediator, someone in between that can help facilitate a conversation to get to some useful results. So those are the two quick things that I would say are really important of engaging in the conversation when you are emotionally prepared to do so, and then bringing someone in at times that can help facilitate it if it is someone that you would like to talk to, but you might not have that, just a relationship to iron out some of your differences.
One of the other things I'd point to, one of those final slides I included, we have some resources at the National Institute for Civil Discourse called engagingdifferences.org. And at the heart of this practice, some of those resources will amplify this, but in the nature of the work that I do, this idea of active listening, right? So this intentionality to take time, especially when our natural instinct is to, and for some of us, are the way that we talk, it's called overlapping, right? So you are finished talking, I'm already thinking about what I'm going to say, right? So we're kind of build and roll. Others are a little bit more oriented to pause and such. But the sense of stepping back and allowing yourself to sit with what's being said, whether you agree with it or not. I think this is also one of those challenges, is that, and this is also why misinformation is kind of easy to spread. If it's something you agree with, oh my gosh, this story, it has to be right because it's hitting kind of those implicit biases that I've got, and then it goes. And then only later you might choose to retract, but often the reality is it's already gone. It's gone out of the barn, so to speak, right? And it's no longer yours to deal with. But there's a wonderful line from a mentor of mine. Right before our event tonight, I was on a Zoom call celebrating 40 years of leadership at the Kettering Foundation in Dayton, Ohio, by a man by the name of David Matthews. And if you're not familiar with the Kettering Foundation, I would encourage you to take a look. It's a tremendous resource for Ohio and literally for the world. But one of the people that I met there, his name was Howse, and he has this line. It used to be on one of my doors before I moved to my current office. And he talked about this. He said, listen so deeply that you might be changed by what you hear. And I've always been struck by that because he did work in conflict areas like Israel, across the Middle East, in Kazakhstan and other places. He was in the State Department for a while, and he brought this idea of sustained dialogue. But at the heart of that, and Kettering's work and NICDs and other organizations, many that have kind of propped up in the last number of years, is this orientation to how do we build relationships? How do we step into this, especially when we do have these differences, right? How do we engage constructively? But at the heart of that is this willingness to do so, right? If all I'm bringing is my advocacy of my position, it turns out that's not going to go super well. And I think as Congresswoman Howse noted, right, sometimes there's a formal process that you need somebody to help you navigate that. But there are ways that we can also do some of this as well. And so even spending a little bit of time looking around this landscape in this arena, I think becomes really indicative of the kind of longing that a lot of people have in this moment. So I think it's not necessarily this desire of like, I'm really interested in just fighting all the time. I think that's one of the things that's happened for the last number of years. Usually we have this kind of ebb and flow, intensity around election cycle, and it kind of goes back down. We've dialed up the notch so much for the last number of election cycles that it's stayed turned up. How do we dial some of that back down? Well, part of it is like showing up, leaning your arms over the fence, watching kids play Little League, or it's about showing up in if you're in a faith community or whatever it might be. How do we just function as people? And those conversations that aren't led in by, and this is where social media has become a real challenge, is when we start to flag of like, I'm so-and-so, I have these views. We don't have to interact in a way of just like, my name's Tim. I live down the street now, right? How do we talk? Only in time do we begin to maybe learn some of these sorts of things. But if our first indication, and this is why that Pew research is so indicative of the challenge that we find ourselves in, if what drives us is if I'm team red or if I'm team blue or any of this sort of thing, I shop at this grocery store or I drive this kind of car, and you've made all of your assumptions about me, this is not going to go very well.
Tim, you inspired me with a couple things. One is that idea of politics as identity. It's pretty damaging in a lot of ways because so much of our identity is so much more than politics, right? We're all very three-dimensional people that have a lot more to us than just our politics. Especially as a candidate, you just get reduced to an R or a D I do a lot of campaigning right now because it's election season, and I was out knocking on doors last weekend, and I remember a guy came to a door and said, "What are you?" And of course, I knew what he meant. He was asking, "What party am I?" But I was really tempted to be kind of a wise guy and say, "Well, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a soldier, I'm a," like, but he just wanted to know, what party am I? And then he was going to make big decisions about whether I was worthwhile to listen to or not, based on that. And it's unfortunate that it's gotten there. The other thing that you talked about is active listening. And that idea that I think all of our moms taught us, that you've got two ears and one mouth for a reason. And not every conversation is a contest. You don't have to be declared the winner of a conversation. They're not debates where you have to go in and sort of dominate the other person and somehow win them over to your side and whatever else. Sometimes you really just want to learn from their viewpoint and take away some knowledge from what they're offering as well. And then the last thing is, sometimes it takes a gimmick. And I say gimmick, like, have a beer, go for a beer. Or I organize this thing every year that I call the Community Leaders Kayaking Trip. It sounds like the silliest thing ever, but we get a group of people together, elected officials, business leaders from both parties, nonprofit leaders, whatever, and we all go kayaking for the day. And it's hard to be pretentious when you've got mud between your toes because you're out on the river kayaking, and it strips away a lot of the partisan armor, and you're just people out there having a good time. And then the good conversations really start to ensue.
The next question I wanted to pose for our panelists is, when you're confronted with something that's completely an untruth, and you're seeing it again from some of that vitriol that we've discussed today, what is a specific tactic or tactics you take to address that point without giving kind of more fuel to the fire?
So for me, I call a thing, right? I believe in being a truth teller. Tell the truth, right? Tell the truth and show receipts, right? Like, that is many times, and then you move on, right? As false information comes your way, and if you have an opportunity to tell the truth and share truth, then I feel like people should take an opportunity to do that, because again, we're competing with the right, the wrong, truth, false, and the only way to overcome that is for those who know the truth, who have that real information, to be willing to share it, no matter how exhausting it may be, and helping others to have the courage to do the same.
This is particularly challenging in the scenario of election misinformation, because a lot of times this is built on a foundation of something people really want to believe. And again, it's on both the right and the left. When your favorite candidate loses, you don't want to believe that they legitimately lost. It's kind of like that feeling that I think we've all had watching a football game or whatever else, elections, and not wanting to believe the results is kind of the construct. But then on top of that gets built all of this other stuff. And it's really hard to convince people of that because they deeply want to believe it. What I've found is that you have to be forthright about it and help people understand what the truth is. And here's the accurate information. And here's a way that you can learn, or whatever else. Also, I've found that I, as the chief elections officer for the state, can do 100 TV interviews and 100 radio interviews and 100 newspaper interviews, and that's not nearly as powerful as people in your own community who you go to church with, go to school with, whatever else, being the source of that information. So as a public official, I try to empower people, the truth tellers, as it relates to election integrity type questions, for sure.
Yeah, and maybe my quick add on to that piece is, and I'm not in elected office, right? I sit in a different sort of spot. is I think attending to the kind of nuance to some of these elements and also recognizing the severity, right? So given the question earlier about the kind of voter fraud, right? Talking about the extent to which these things happen, it becomes really important. And also being able to own up to the, how do I say this? The appeal of stretching truths in a way that kind of amplifies certain kinds of messages, right? How do we navigate those things? And I think being kind of the honest, kind of truthful actors is part of what I study is democratic institutions, civil discourse, and the like. The great kind of receding of democratic practices across the globe, and we've seen it for a number of years, not just in last election cycles, although even Italy just the last day, right, is kind of pointing to how things are moving around. So it's a little bit less left and right sort of things, but it's more, do you believe in democracy or do you believe in something else, right? So the rise kind of the authoritarian tendencies and the like is a real concern. And at the foundation of this is these, the ability to trust in elections, to think about the voice and agency of citizens. And there's all sorts of situations that either make that more difficult or not, right? And so being as clear as possible about those things and realizing we're in the same situation, right? It's not a game either, right? These are our lives. This is what's going on here. So to step back from that kind of gamification of politics is really important, but also to be as truthful as possible, realizing that also has implications, especially for again, not for myself, but like for others in these moments that they're either amplifying good messaging or bad messaging. But I think it also is not only these institutions, it's not only those in official positions, but it is all of us, right? So thinking about this in a holistic way, it's a both and. It's you and everybody else.
We're getting very close to our deadline here for the end of the webinar. So I'd like to give each of you 30 seconds to close on what you think is the most important thing. If you had an elevator pitch to explain what you think is kind of most important from our discussion this evening, what would it be?
Okay, well, don't be shy. I think for me, and listening to this conversation, I always will say, tell the truth. You got to tell the truth. I saw someone ask, well, what if they're a supporter and it costs a vote? Tell the truth. You know what I'm saying? Because just as you can get one and you might lose one, you can get another one. And I think where we need to go for just building people up, you got to start from a place of truth and actually listen. I think, I want to raise that up, that whole thing of being an active listener. Sometimes people may not be able to clearly articulate what they want, but if you listen, if you truly listen, you'll be able to find some commonalities in people where we think there are divides that can help us move forward and work together for the benefit of the whole. So that's what I would like to share.
I guess I'll go next. It's just that this is a problem worth solving. This is work worth doing. I think we need to start from that context. I've got this maybe overly romantic view of American history, but I think that each generation of Americans has had a big project to work on, whether it's winning the world wars or putting a man on the moon or the civil rights movement or working to bring about women's suffrage. Each generation has sort of solved a big problem and left it a little bit better than we found it. I'm starting to feel like our generation's big chore is going to be to make self-government work again, to make democracy flourish again. And that all rests on civility. It doesn't work without people being able to interact with one another in a thoughtful and productive way. And so in that sense, I think this is work worth doing. I think we should pour ourselves into it and really work to make civics and civility work better through civil discourse. I also want to say, because this is on my mind right now, voter registration is right now. And if you know somebody who turned 18 this year, if you know somebody that moved into your neighborhood, remind them to get registered to vote. Maybe this is the good entree to meet your neighbor. that just moved into the neighborhood, go ask them if they're registered to vote, and remind them to visit voteohio.gov to become a registered voter. And then the other pitch is consider signing up to be a poll worker. You'll find it to be a really rewarding experience. We need 50,000 Ohioans to staff 4,000 polling locations. And again, you can sign up to be an election official at voteohio.gov. So I just had to make those pitches as well.
Absolutely appropriate. So if that ate up some of my elevator pitch, that's great. The two very quick things I would say, and one kind of points back to John Dewey, who wrote lots of things in the early 20th century. So I'd encourage you to go poke around a little bit if you've not heard that name before. But to think about democracy as a way of life, and it's not just institutions, it's not just state legislatures and the like, but think about democracy as something we practice and that we live. It's a both and. And then the second kind of quick thing here is for all of us to be intellectually curious, have some degree of humility, right, as we're stepping into conversations, especially when we feel really confident that we have the right answer. So be people with questions.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. I want to thank Dr. Shaffer, City Councilwoman Howse, and Secretary LaRose all for your time this evening. We hope to have more of these types of conversations. I, of course, want to thank Leadership Ohio and the National Institute for Civil Discourse and the Next Generation program. I want to thank everyone who helped put this together. Thank you to all the attendees. We hope you'll continue to follow the work of these great organizations and check out the resources that were suggested tonight from our panelists. And we also hope you'll continue this conversation at #CivilFuture. So please, please continue this conversation. This is something that obviously can't be covered in its totality in an hour, but we're still thankful for everyone's time, and we hope we'll have more engaging discussions in the future. So again, on behalf of Leadership Ohio, we hope those of you in Ohio that would like to engage in a statewide leadership program, we hope you'll look at Leadership Ohio. We again hope you'll look at the great resources at the National Institute of Civil Discourse. And again, thank you very much, everyone, and good night. And that this program will be recorded for other folks to be able to watch. We hope you'll spread the word and perhaps allow other folks to see this presentation as well. So thank you very much and good evening.